the anatomy of the esophagus. I think I've talked about the anatomy of this end and down at this end, but I haven't looked at the esophagus as a whole. And that's going to be the focus, is having you haven't got one, but we're going to be having a very visual look at the esophagus. Where is it in relation to the aorta, to the vertebrae, to the airways, all that sort of stuff, right? Plus blood supply, innervation, and a bit of lymphatics. Oh, and what goes wrong with the esophagus? It's got a couple of sphincters. One of them needs to work better than it does in some people. Okay, let's take you apart. All right, we can see the lungs, the heart. Going to have to take a lot of bits out. This is a good model though, because we've got the esophagus on its own. Right, so there's the aorta, right? There's the superior vena cava. This is the heart. So the aorta is leaving the heart and curving around to the left and posteriorly. The superior and inferior vena cava are on the other side. So if I take the heart out, that's our target. There's the esophagus. Now here's the airway. Left main bronchus, right main bronchus. You are looking a bit grubby. Maybe I should have got the cleaner model. Oh well, we're there now. Let me take out the rest of the lungs. Spin. Put the airway back because we're interested in that. Put the head and neck back because that's where the esophagus comes from. Okay, so we're already answering some of those questions I posed at the beginning there. But what is the esophagus? Well, it's a muscular tube, so we can see here that it looks a little bit stripy. So it's a tube connecting the pharynx with the stomach that's there. So the food and drink that we eat gets passed down the esophagus and goes to the stomach and then gets pushed into the digestive tract, and we digest all those lovely things. It's a muscular tube, and the muscles are arranged in two directions. Some of them are arranged along the length of the muscle, and that's what we're seeing with these lengthwise stripes here. And some of them are arranged in a circular fashion around the tube. And we see this in muscular tubes that can do peristalsis, that is, they can push things along the lumen inside them, right? So they can squeeze and shorten, and that gives us the wave-like thing of peristalsis that pushes food and drink down the esophagus. This means that you can eat and drink standing on your head. That's not a recommendation, it's just that you can. And that means that you can also eat and drink in space, in zero gravity, because it's not a passive gravity-fed tube, this. It's an active muscular tube that takes even the liquid down and pushes it down to your stomach. Inside that tube, there's an epithelium. So inside that tube, there is an external surface inside us. So like the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, the cells lining it are an epithelial cell type, and we'll talk about that later when we talk about things that go wrong with the esophagus. And it's a little bit different. The esophagus changes along its length. So I said that the esophagus starts up in the pharynx. What do I mean by that? There's the oral cavity, there's the nasal cavity. The pharynx is the space posterior to those. So food and water goes in here. I think I've done a video about swallowing. The soft palate closes this off so it doesn't go into the nasal cavity, but as you swallow, that goes down into the esophagus. That's the esophagus there. Oh wow, it looks tiny, there's hardly anything to it. Why is that? Well, it's a tube, but most of the time it's a collapsed tube. If you're not passing anything down it, it's going to get squashed, right? And it actually has a sphincter at the top and the bottom. It has an upper esophageal sphincter up here and a lower esophageal sphincter where the esophagus meets the stomach, which keep the ends of the esophagus closed. Most of the time you're breathing. You want air to go down the larynx. This is the larynx here. This is where you make sound. There's the trachea there. So the esophagus is posterior to the trachea, and it's linking the pharynx here with the stomach as that tube. Remember that inside the body there aren't really any free spaces. There are lots of pressures inside the thorax, inside the abdomen, and these pressures are all pushing against and competing against other things, which means that if you have a tube that doesn't have anything in it, it's not going to stay open like you might look in the textbooks, it's going to get squashed flat. So when we look at the esophagus, most of the time it's squashed flat. It's a flat, oval-looking muscular tube. It's about 25 centimeters long in most people and runs from about the C6 vertebral level to the T11 vertebral level. This here is the diaphragm, so it's disappearing through the diaphragm there. And I said that it changes along its length. Anatomically, we think about the esophagus as having three parts, like a cervical part in the neck, a thoracic part in the thorax, and an abdominal part in the abdomen. Seems logical, right? The thoracic part is clearly the longest bit. We'll see in a moment that the abdominal part's really short, the stomach's right there. But up here, in the neck, when you swallow, when you move things around in the oral cavity, there's a lot of skeletal muscle there. That is striated muscle, muscle that you have voluntary control over, right? Whereas as you get further along the gastrointestinal tract, the stomach is also made of muscle, your intestines are made of muscle, but they're under involuntary control. You can't choose to make your stomach contract. So the esophagus is largely voluntary muscle at the cervical end and blends to become entirely smooth muscle as it gets down to the lower third, right, to the lower part. Remember that the diaphragm here, the diaphragm is also skeletal muscle. You can choose to move your diaphragm. It's under voluntary control, it's skeletal muscle. Most of the time you don't, because various cool feedback loops in your brainstem are moving your diaphragm for you, so you don't have to think about it all the time. But the diaphragm will have a role in what the esophagus does as well, right? So the muscle type changes as we descend down the esophagus, and the blood supply changes as we descend down the esophagus. All right, have a look at big head. So, I said that, all right, there's the oral cavity there. So if I spin you around, posteriorly here, we're looking at the muscles of the pharynx, the muscles that are making that tube. And that there then, that is the esophagus. Next to the trachea, so the big round opening, there's the trachea. It's always open because you're always breathing. There's the esophagus. It's usually flattened because you're not usually passing things down it. When you do pass things down it, the muscles will relax, allow the food to go in, and peristalsis will push it down. But what we're looking at here is these are the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. So they're running around from structures anteriorly to make the lateral and posterior walls of the pharynx. And this is the inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscle. Oh, don't fall apart on me. Down here is the larynx. That's the thyroid cartilage. Under here is the cricoid cartilage. So the cricoid cartilage is under there. The cricoid cartilage is at the top of the trachea. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing the inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscle, and we're seeing a muscle called cricopharyngeus that goes from the cricoid cartilage and around, and also makes part of the pharynx. And this is where the esophagus starts. So the upper esophageal sphincter, the muscle that keeps the esophagus closed at the top end, is pretty good at keeping the esophagus closed at the top end. And it's formed from the inferior pharyngeal constrictor muscle, this guy here, and cricopharyngeus. And, oh, there it is, under there, right? And then we have the muscle of the esophagus descending, but that's where it starts. And then the esophagus descends and enters the thorax. So here's the first rib here. So once the esophagus has passed the first rib, it's left the neck and it's entered the thorax. There's the trachea again then, and the two main bronchi. So if I take the trachea off, we can now see the esophagus really nicely. So the esophagus is posterior to the trachea in the thorax, and we can see the descending aorta here, so the thoracic aorta. Now if I put the heart back in, you can see where the esophagus is relative to the heart. So the esophagus is posterior to the heart, right? And the aorta is going to be anterior to the airways and the esophagus, but anterior to the airways. Then it's going to curve around to the left as the aortic arch, and posteriorly, so that angle is important there. So it's going to then be lateral on the left side of the esophagus, and then it's going to descend with the esophagus to the left of the esophagus, just lateral to the esophagus, but adjacent to the esophagus. Anatomists love words. And then the aorta and the esophagus are both going to pass through the diaphragm, but through two different holes. The aorta is going to sneak down the back, really, whereas the esophagus has its own special hole, the esophageal hiatus in the diaphragm. So those are the anatomical relations which are really important. And then there's the diaphragm, there's that hole there. That's the esophageal hiatus. Let's take the diaphragm away for a moment. Let's put the esophagus back here in, so we see where we are. Here's the liver. Let me remove the liver just so we can see better. The liver there was wrapped around the inferior vena cava, which is going to go straight through the diaphragm, then into the heart. So now you can see we're flowing around a little bit. But you can see where the esophagus is in relation to these other really, really important tubes. Now here's the stomach. So you can see the esophagus is passing to the stomach. So this is where the esophagus is going to end. And look at the angle it takes. The esophagus doesn't just go straight down into the top of the stomach. It does this little curve. So it goes into the stomach at an angle, and the fundus of the stomach is actually superior to the esophagus. It fills the dome of the diaphragm up here. So down here is the lower esophageal sphincter. This is the other end of the esophagus, which is closed. This sphincter is probably more important than the upper esophageal sphincter. The stomach, for example, makes acid so as to activate inactivated peptidases, enzymes that break down proteins, because we're made of proteins, we don't want to break ourselves down. That's a story for another day, maybe. But there's acid in the stomach. The stomach and the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, are adapted to cope with that acid, whereas the esophagus is not. So we have a lower esophageal sphincter here. However, it's generally considered as not a proper anatomical sphincter, but a physiological sphincter, which means there are a number of things that are happening here to close off the esophagus at its lower end. Now remember, for one, we have the diaphragm right here, so it's passing through the diaphragm, and the esophagus is attached to the diaphragm. I've talked about hiatus hernia elsewhere, so I've talked about that anatomy in more detail. But the gap, the hole that the esophagus goes through in the diaphragm, well, the diaphragm, being skeletal muscle, can squeeze the esophagus and help keep the esophagus closed. Like I said, the esophagus is attached to the diaphragm, so as the diaphragm moves, the esophagus moves with it. So that's one part. So the diaphragm is part of the lower esophageal sphincter function. And then, of course, the esophagus is largely muscle. So the muscle at the lower end of the esophagus normally has tone, so that the walls of the esophagus are squeezed together by the smooth muscle there, and that has to relax for anything to pass through. And then, of course, we have this angle at which the esophagus goes into the stomach, and that angle probably has an effect to help pinch closed or kink closed the esophagus a little bit. And then on top of that, we have the idea of pressures. So there is a pressure inside the thorax, which changes as you breathe in and out. And there is also a pressure in the abdomen. because this is all held in by layers of muscle, right? So everything's held in there, which creates a pressure inside. And if you increase the tension in the muscles of your abdomen, you increase the pressure in here. So there's pressure inside the abdomen, there's pressure inside the thorax, and it's likely that a high pressure in the abdomen is going to squeeze closed the walls of the esophagus, because if there's nothing in it, why would it be open, right? The high pressure outside would squeeze the walls together. So it's these factors together that seem to form the lower esophageal sphincter. And the purpose of the lower esophageal sphincter then is to stop stomach contents from going that way and make sure they only go that way. Now the stomach at the other end, between the stomach and the duodenum, it has a pyloric sphincter, which is an excellent anatomical sphincter, and when you feel this in a person or a cadaver, it's super chunky, proper thick muscle, which keeps everything in the stomach. But the lower esophageal sphincter is not quite so good. So the result of this is that in some people, they get heartburn, they get a chest pain. So this is often associated with eating, anticipation of eating, or after eating, or during eating. And many people will recognize this as heartburn, a pain in the chest caused by acid reflux into the esophagus. So pain and discomfort. And we'll come back to that later. Now these two sphincters, the upper esophageal sphincter and the lower esophageal sphincter, when you're eating food and drinking, they need to relax to allow whatever you're swallowing to pass through the esophagus, and then we get that wave of peristalsis pushing the contents down, and again that sphincter needs to relax so that passes into the stomach. The rest of the time they're closed. When burping, so if the stomach is filled with gas, for that gas to leave the stomach, both the lower esophageal sphincter and the upper esophageal sphincter also have to relax to allow the gas out. And many people will recognize this as a kind of a voluntary action that you've learned. The skeletal muscle up here you can control, and the diaphragm down here you can control, and you can control the pressures in the thorax and the abdomen because of all the skeletal muscle in the wall, right? You've learned how to burp. Vomiting is the same. Vomiting is a bit more of a reflex, but again, for the stomach to empty, the lower esophageal sphincter and the upper esophageal sphincter need to relax to allow the contents out, right? Okay, the blood supply of the esophagus. Think about those three parts again. Up in the neck, so the thyroid gland is here, and can we see there's an inferior thyroid artery that supplies blood to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is wrapped around the trachea. The trachea is right next to the esophagus. So there are esophageal branches from the inferior thyroid artery that supply blood to the upper part of the esophagus. In the thorax, well, look at that. The esophagus is right next to the aorta. So we see esophageal branches coming straight off the aorta to the esophagus. And then as we get down to the diaphragm and the stomach, well, in the lesser curvature of the stomach here, we have a left gastric artery on the left side and a right gastric artery on the right side. Hey, look, the esophagus is on the left. So the left gastric artery will supply blood to the lower part of the esophagus, and also the diaphragm is here, and there are inferior phrenic arteries, phrenic referring to the diaphragm. So arteries going to the diaphragm to its underneath, to its inferior surface. The inferior phrenic artery will often also give branches to the lower part of the esophagus. For once, we're actually really interested in the venous drainage of the esophagus. So the upper part of the esophagus also has veins, esophageal veins draining to the inferior thyroid vein again. Now in the thorax, what we can see posteriorly in there, what we can see in here a little bit are the veins of the posterior thoracic wall. There's an azygos system of veins. There's the azygos veins on this side, the hemiazygos veins on this side. So the esophagus, where have you gone? The esophagus is going to drain to the azygos and hemiazygos veins. And also there are veins between the ribs. We've got the intercostal veins in there. So the esophagus in the middle portion will drain to the azygos and hemiazygos veins, intercostal veins, which are also going to drain to the azygos is the key word, right? And then as we get down to the stomach, there is a left gastric vein. So the lower esophagus can drain to the esophageal system of veins and to the left gastric vein. Now the left gastric vein is going to drain to the hepatic portal vein and the liver. And that's why the veins are so interesting. When we talk about the liver, we talk about portosystemic anastomoses. The blood from the gastrointestinal tract travels to the liver. And as I said before, the liver wraps around the inferior vena cava. So all that blood goes through the liver and then to the inferior vena cava. The reason that's important is because the hepatocytes, the cells of the liver, do lots of interesting things with all those things that you have digested, that you have absorbed. So the liver is part of that digestion process. So it's a portal vein because this is a vein that's carrying blood from one organ to another organ. And that's great. There's a huge amount of blood that has to go through the liver to get back to the inferior vena cava. And the blood from the lower esophagus can take that route through the left gastric vein to the hepatic portal vein in the liver. But with liver disease, over time, the liver is very good at regenerating, but the number of times it's asked to regenerate can lead to the development of more connective tissue within the liver, fibrosis, cirrhosis of the liver. And as the liver becomes more fibrosed inside, there's more connective tissue in there, it's harder for all that blood to pass through the tiny, fine channels of that the blood normally passes through to get to the inferior vena cava. Now, when it's hard for blood to pass through something, the resistance to flow increases. And if the resistance to flow through that direction increases, maybe the blood can follow an easier route to get back to the systemic circulation. And that's what we see at the lower esophagus. If the blood can't flow through the liver, that blood that's trying to flow through the liver will instead go in the opposite direction through the left gastric vein to the esophageal veins in the lower esophagus, because they all link up. Veins love to do that. And then it can flow into the esophageal system of veins, which are actually going to drain into the superior vena cava up here, and then back to the heart, and they go off around the body. Sounds like a great solution, but the veins of the esophagus are not great at taking that increased volume of blood. Veins are not as muscular as arteries, so when veins take more blood than they normally do, they get stretched. So these veins will stretch and they'll become distended. And what we find then, those are varicose veins, those are varices. But those are varices in the esophagus. If those varices expand to the point where they break and they burst, then that blood is going to bleed into the esophagus. This is going to lead to hematemesis, the vomiting of blood. Can you see how that's really, really dangerous? You're now bleeding internally, losing blood, and you're vomiting that blood out. And it's not in an easy place to put pressure on that bleeding to stop it. So the lower esophagus is the interesting part in terms of blood supply. The veins down here can drain to the esophageal system, in the thorax, or the left gastric vein, which will go to the liver. So it's a portosystemic anastomosis. As a result of liver disease, we might see lower esophageal varices because the blood flows in a different direction and more blood than normal flows through these veins. Dangerous. Okay, different model. Innervation. So there's the heart. If I take the heart out, there's the esophagus, right? See if I can take the airway out as well. So there's the esophagus. And in terms of what innervates the esophagus, we can see now that beautiful nerve that's running down on either side of the esophagus, that is the vagus nerve. We can see the left and right vagus nerves. This is a really important bit of anatomy. So what's happening here is the vagus nerve, it's a cranial nerve, it comes out of the brainstem. One of its main jobs is going to be to innervate the gastrointestinal tract. So as it drops down the neck and gets into the thorax, its next task is to go and find the esophagus. And it runs down the esophagus, and that then is its pathway to get through the diaphragm and into the abdomen and the rest of the gastrointestinal tract. And as it passes down the diaphragm, it passes the lungs and the heart, so we can innervate those as well. So the esophagus, as I said, it's innervated It has skeletal muscle at the top and it has somatic muscle, has smooth muscle further down. The vagus nerve also innervates the muscles of the pharynx. So the vagus nerve is innervating the esophagus as we descend. So in the involuntary parts, the vagus nerve will give parasympathetic innervation. Now the other thing we can see here is we can see the sympathetic trunk. The sympathetic trunk, well, the sympathetic nerves are the other part of the involuntary nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and the sympathetic nerves come out of the spinal cord in the thorax, levels T1 to about L1, and that's what we're seeing here. And look, you can see the aorta is covered with sympathetic nerves and they're running to the esophagus and many other places. So the esophagus is innervated by the vagus nerve and sympathetic nerves. Of course, here's the larynx. We said that the esophagus is posterior to the larynx and the recurrent laryngeal nerve innervates the larynx. The esophagus is right next to the trachea and the larynx. It's right next to the recurrent laryngeal nerve. The recurrent laryngeal nerve is a branch of the vagus nerve, so that upper part, the esophagus, is receiving branches from the recurrent laryngeal nerve as well. Fun, huh? So that's innervation, blood supply, lymphatics. Lymphatic drainage of the esophagus, again, we think about those three parts, those three sections. So up in the neck, the esophagus is going to drain lymph to deep cervical lymph nodes. In the thorax, the esophagus is going to drain to posterior mediastinal lymph nodes. So that's encompassing all sorts of groups of lymph nodes that we find in the posterior mediastinum. And then in the distal esophagus, well, again, we're going to see that collection of left gastric lymph nodes, which will drain to the celiac lymph nodes and so on, right? Okay, so we talked about GORD or GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, that is acid reflux from the stomach into the esophagus. GORD in the UK, GERD elsewhere in the world, because we spell esophagus differently. Now, chronically, this can lead to something called Barrett's esophagus. That is, if this is happening over a long period of time. The epithelium inside the esophagus is a stratified squamous epithelium, which is good at dealing with things that you've chewed and sent down here before they're fully digested. But with Barrett's esophagus, we see a metaplasia. We see a change in that differentiated cell type from a stratified squamous epithelium, that is lots of layers of flat cells, to a simple columnar epithelium, that is very tall cells in a single layer, but that which is more like what we see in the stomach. That in itself is not a problem, but there is an association with a development of esophageal adenocarcinoma, which is a dangerous cancer. Now, if somebody has Barrett's esophagus, that does not mean that they will develop an esophageal adenocarcinoma, but it does seem to mean that they have an increased chance of developing an esophageal adenocarcinoma. So that's Barrett's esophagus, its association with GORD and esophageal cancer. But also, that's the anatomy of the esophagus, where it starts, where it ends, it's two sphincters, its blood supply, its innervation, its lymphatic drainage, and what have you. And hopefully a nice visual look at where it is in relation to the other major structures of the thorax, because that's so important to understanding where something is seeing it visually. It's much easier than describing how it runs. Okay, see you in the next one. There are a couple of videos, like I say, there's a video about hiatus hernia. I think I've done a video about swallowing, or maybe it's on my to-do list. Anyway, search YouTube. It's got quite a good search thing.